Cole Hartwell was reading the agency letter for the first time when the stagecoach door burst open and a woman fell into the snow. Not stepped, not climbed down, fell. She hit the frozen ground on her hands and knees, and the two little girls behind her screamed, and the whole street went dead quiet except for the wind. And Cole saw her face when she looked up. One eye swollen shut, lips split and badly healed, holding her ribs with one arm like she was keeping herself from coming apart. A folded note dropped from her coat into the mud at his boots. He picked it up, read it once, then looked at those two children standing in the snow, and every wall he had spent 4 years building came down in a single breath. If you're watching this from somewhere across this country, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far Cole and Maggie's story travels.
Hit that subscribe button, hit that like, and don't you go anywhere. Because what happens in the next 2 hours is going to reach straight into your chest and remind you that it is never, ever too late to find your way home. The letter had been sitting on Cole Hartwell's kitchen table for 11 days. He'd left it next to the coffee cup Clara used to use. That was reason enough not to open it. He'd written to the agency in Denver on a cold night in October, one of those nights when the wind comes down off the mountains and finds every gap in the log walls, and the silence inside gets so heavy a man can feel it pressing on his sternum. He'd written 3 sentences, described the ranch, said the winters were hard and a man should be honest about that up front. Said if a woman wanted to come, she was welcome. He hadn't expected anyone to say yes. When the reply came, he'd left it on the table next to Clara's cup and gone out to fix the north fence and told himself he'd read it when the light was better. He said that for 11 days. On the 12th day, he opened it. Margaret Cross, 34, widow, 2 daughters, Alice, 10, and Daisy, 6. Experienced in household management, preserving, basic medical care, willing to travel. There was a photograph. He looked at it longer than he meant to. She looked like a woman who had been tired for years and had learned to wear it so well most people stopped noticing. He wrote back that morning. She could come if she wanted. He'd be at the stage on December 3rd. He did not mention the grave behind the cottonwood. Some things waited for trust. December 3rd arrived with 23 below and a sky the color of old bone. Cole drove the wagon into Granger Falls 2 hours before the stage was due, and he told himself it was because the creek crossing was icy and he needed extra time. That was not the reason, and he knew it and kept moving anyway. He parked outside the territorial office and stood in the cold because standing in the cold was preferable to sitting inside, being watched and speculated about. Pete Hargrove found him inside of 10 minutes. Pete ran the feed store and had the particular gift of a man who says exactly what he's thinking without once stopping to ask whether he should. He came across the frozen street with his hands in his coat pockets and his chin forward, like a man who'd just thought of something clever. "Cole Hartwell," he called out. "You actually showed up." Cole kept his eyes on the road south. "Heard she's a widow," Pete said, pulling up beside him, "with 2 young ones. That right?" He shook his head with the satisfied air of a man confirming a rumor he'd already told 3 people. "Man in your position, you could have had any unattached woman in the territory. Instead, you ordered yourself a ready-made family from a catalog." "Pete, I'm just saying what folks are. I know what you're saying." Cole turned and looked at him. Not angry, just flat and quiet and certain. "And I want you to hear me when I tell you that if you say one word to that woman or those children when they get off that stage, I will make sure every rancher in this valley knows you watered the grain you sold me last spring." Pete's mouth closed. "You watered it," Cole said. "I weighed it. I let it go because I didn't feel like the trouble. I'll feel like it if you give me reason."
He looked back at the road. "You understand me." Pete Hargrove found somewhere urgent to be. The stage came around the bend 40 minutes later, moving slow, the horses laboring in the cold. Cole walked to the edge of the street. His hands were steady. His jaw was tight. He told himself this was just practical. The ranch needed more than one pair of hands, and that was the whole of it. The coach rocked to a stop. Calhoun climbed down from the box, caught Cole's eye, and his expression said something that Cole had no framework for yet. Not pity, not warning. Something careful. "Hartwell," Calhoun said. "Got your party?" He paused. "They had a rough ride." Before Cole could ask what that meant, the door flew open. A small hand, 6 years old, dark blonde hair gone wild, red-cheeked, eyes the color of creek water in spring, and wide with the specific fear of a child who has learned that arrival does not automatically mean safe. She dropped from the step and immediately turned back and reached up with both arms. "Mama! Mama, come on, I got you!" The older girl came next. 10 years old, auburn hair, brown eyes, a face that had learned early and well not to show what was happening behind it. She stepped down without hesitation and put herself immediately at her sister's side, one hand on the smaller girl's shoulder. Steady, automatic, like she'd done it 10,000 times. Then the woman came through the door, and her boot caught the ice on the bottom step, and she went down. Hard. Hands and knees in the frozen mud, the impact driving a sound out of her that she clearly did not mean to make. Short, sharp, bitten off the moment it started. Both girls cried out. The little one grabbed her mother's arm. The older one dropped to her knees and got her hands under her mother's elbow and said, "Mama, I got you, I got you," in a voice that was 10 years old and 40 years old at the same time. Cole was already moving. He crossed the distance between them in 4 strides, crouched, got his hand under her other arm. "Ma'am, I've got you." She looked up at him, and he saw her face. The bruising had faded to that sickly yellow-green that meant it was old. 2 weeks, maybe 3. But old didn't mean small. It had covered half her face when it was fresh. Her left eye was still slightly swollen at the outer corner. Her bottom lip had been split and had healed into a small ridge of scar tissue that would be permanent. She held her ribs with her free arm, in the careful, automatic way of a person who has done it so many times the gesture has become unconscious. Her eyes were green. That was the thing he noticed, which made no sense to notice under the circumstances. But he noticed it. Green, with flecks of gold, and in them right now, not fear, not shame, though those were there too, but a calculation, fast and sharp and exhausted. She was measuring him, measuring the distance to the coach, measuring options. "Margaret Cross," she said. Her voice was level, Eastern, but not soft. Teacher's voice, the kind that had learned to stay steady when everything around it wasn't. "I'm Margaret Cross." Cole Hartwell. He helped her to her feet, felt her pull back from his grip the moment she had her balance. Not rude, just reflexive. "You all right?" "I'm fine." She was not fine. They both knew it. "There's ice on that step." "Yes," she said. "I noticed." He almost said something, and didn't. He stepped back, giving her space, and that was when the folded note fell from her coat pocket. It dropped straight down into the mud between them. She saw it the same moment he did. Something moved across her face. Resignation, maybe, or relief. Like a decision that had already been made was now just becoming official. Cole picked it up, looked at her. She gave him a single nod. He stepped away from the coach and unfolded the paper and read it. The handwriting was neat and careful. The handwriting of someone who had been educated and held on to it because it was one of the things that couldn't be taken. Mr. Hartwell, you deserve the truth about who is arriving at your door. My husband did not die in an ordinary accident. Robert Cross was drunk when he fell from his horse. He was drunk most days in the last 2 years of his life. He had been a different kind of man when I married him at 22. By the end, he was the kind of man who made sure his daughters learned to be very quiet and very still whenever they heard his boots on the porch steps, because quiet and still was the only way to stay safe. The bruises you will see on my face are from the week before he died. I am telling you this so you don't waste time wondering. I am not telling you this to ask for your sympathy or your pity. I have had enough of both from people who offered it and then did nothing. I am telling you because you are a man who deserves accurate information before he makes a decision that affects his life. If you read this and decide you don't want us, I will understand. I will find another way. Alice and I have found other ways before, and we will again. But if you are willing, if you can look at me and my daughters and see not damage, but survival, I will work harder than any woman you have ever known. I will pull my weight every single day. I will ask for nothing beyond what we agree to. And I will never, as long as I live, cause you to regret the decision to open your door. Respectfully, Margaret E. Cross. Cole read it twice, folded it carefully along the original creases, put it in his jacket pocket, and pressed his palm flat against it for one moment. Then he turned around. She was watching him from beside the coach. The little one had pressed herself against her mother's leg. The older girl was standing slightly in front of them both. Not consciously, Cole thought. Just the way a 10-year-old positions herself when she has spent years being the first line of defense. The whole street was watching. He could feel it without looking. He walked back to them. "Mrs. Cross," he said. "Mr. Hartwell." Her chin was up. Her hands were still. Whatever the next 30 seconds brought, she had decided she would take it standing straight. "Road back to the ranch has ice on the creek crossing. We're going to lose light in about 3 hours." He looked at the sky, then back at her. "If we leave now, we make it. If we wait, we're stuck in town overnight." He paused. "But we eat first." She stared at him. "We can. When did the girls eat last?" A silence that lasted 2 seconds and answered the question completely. "This morning," she said. "Early." "Then we eat first." He looked down at the little one, who had been staring up at him with the open, uncomplicated suspicion of a 6-year-old who has learned that strange men require investigation. "What's your name?" She leaned further into her mother's leg. "Daisy." "You hungry, Daisy?" She looked up at her mother, back at him. The calculation was almost identical to her mother's, just less disguised. "Yes, sir." He looked at the older girl. She had her mother's eyes, same quality of seeing everything and deciding separately how much to show. "And you?" "Alice," she said. "I'm all right." "Nobody who hasn't eaten since early morning and 23 below is all right," Cole said. "That's just a fact, not an argument." He started walking toward the boarding house. "Come on." He heard them following. 4 sets of boots on frozen ground. Daisy's voice in a whisper asking her mother something. Silence from Alice, which he was already learning to read as its own kind of language. He did not look back. If he had looked back, he would have seen Margaret Cross close her eyes for exactly 1 second, her face doing something private and complicated, something that looked, from a certain angle, like the first breath a person takes after being underwater for a very long time. Mrs. Aldrich at the boarding house fed them without comment and without questions, which was its own form of kindness. Beef stew, cornbread, hot coffee for the adults, warm milk for the girls. Daisy ate with the focused intensity of the genuinely hungry, both hands on the table, spoon moving fast. Alice ate quietly and watched Cole the way a person watches a door they're not sure is locked. Halfway through the meal, she put her spoon down. "You have horses?" she said. "Several." "What are their names?" "The Big Bay is Reckoning. The Gray Mare is November." Alice considered this with the gravity of someone evaluating important information. "Those are good names." "Did you choose them?" "I did." "Why Reckoning?" "First day I had him, he threw me 3 times, and I kept getting back on," Cole said. Seemed like an honest description of the situation. Something shifted in Alice's face. Not quite a smile. The shadow a smile makes before it arrives. "That makes sense," she said, and picked up her spoon again. Across the table, Margaret Cross was watching him over the rim of her coffee cup. She had both hands wrapped around it, the way people hold things when their hands need something to do. The bruising around her eye caught the lamplight, and Cole made himself look at it directly, rather than away from it, because looking away was a form of pretending, and he was done pretending things were what they weren't. "Mrs. Cross," he said. She looked at him. "I read your letter." "I know you did. I want to say something to you." He set down his cup, chose each word the way you choose your footing on ice, one at a time, testing before you commit. "What you wrote in that letter, about staying because of your girls, about enduring what no person should have to endure." He looked at her directly. "I'm not going to offer you pity. You made it clear you don't need it, and I agree with you. What you did to survive, what you're doing right now, sitting in a stranger's town after riding 4 days in December to hand your future to a man you've never met, that is not weakness. That is the hardest kind of courage there is." Her jaw tightened. She looked at the table. "But I'm going to be straight with you too, the way you were straight with me." He kept his voice even. "My ranch is 40 minutes from town in good weather. In a bad winter storm, 3 days. We can be cut off for weeks at a time. The work is hard, and it does not stop." He paused. "What I'm offering is a roof that doesn't leak, food enough for winter, and my word, that what happened to you before will not happen under my roof. Not once. Not ever." The little girl had finished her stew and was now leaning against her mother's arm with the full, boneless weight of a child losing the battle against sleep. Margaret wrapped her arm around her automatically, the way she'd done it every night for 6 years, her hand stroking slow circles without her thinking about it. "And what do you expect in return?" Margaret asked. "That we figure out the rest, like 2 adults, with common sense and no illusions about what this is?" He met her eyes. "Nothing more than that." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her doing it, checking for the catch, looking for the place where the floor dropped away. He let her look. He had nothing to hide and no interest in pretending otherwise. "Alice," Margaret said quietly, still holding his gaze. "Yeah?" Alice said. "What do you think?" Alice set down her spoon. She looked at Cole with those careful, old young eyes, and she was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was.
"He looked at Daisy first," she said, "when we got off the stage, before he looked at you."
She reached for her cornbread. "Men who are going to be mean don't do that." The table went still. Cole said nothing. Margaret said nothing. The fire in the hearth popped once. "All right," Margaret said finally, quietly, like a door closing on one room and opening on another. "We'll come to your ranch." "Good." He stood, reached for his coat. "We should move before the light goes." He was at the door, his hand on the frame, when Daisy's voice came from behind him, small and blurry with sleep, completely unguarded, the way 6-year-olds are when they're too tired to remember to be careful. "Mama," she murmured, "is the big man gonna be mean to us?" Cole stood still with his hand on the frame, did not turn around. Margaret's voice came low and steady. "No, baby." "How do you know?" 3 seconds of silence. "Because he bought us supper," Margaret said, "and he didn't make us ask." Cole pushed through the door and walked out into the cold. He stood in the snow with his face turned up to the sky and breathed out slow, a long white cloud of breath dissolving into the frozen air. The first flakes of the coming storm were starting to fall. Slow, deliberate, the way everything in Wyoming happened in winter. Like the land itself was making a decision and taking its time about it. He pressed his hand flat against his jacket pocket, where her letter was folded. Behind him, he heard Daisy say, in the satisfied tone of someone who has resolved an important matter, "I'm going to call him Mr. Horseman." "You can't call him Bat," Alice said. "Why not?" "Because it's not his name." "It could be his other name. Everybody can have an other name." A pause. "Fine," Alice said. "His other name." Cole Hartwell stood in the snow beside his wagon and laughed. Small and sharp and surprised. Gone almost before it happened. He looked around out of reflex to make sure nobody had witnessed it. Nobody had. Just him and the horses and the snow coming down, and the particular silence of a Wyoming winter that held everything inside it. Grief and habit, and all the complicated territory between a man who had stopped expecting anything and a woman who had learned the same lesson by a harder road. He climbed up onto the wagon seat, and he was gathering the reins when Calhoun appeared at his elbow, quiet as smoke. "Hartwell." The driver's voice was low, not carrying. "One thing I didn't say inside." Cole looked at him. "The man. Her husband." Calhoun's eyes were steady and careful. He didn't just fall drunk off a horse. Cole went still. There was a man on the coach out of Columbus. Traveled with them from Ohio to Cheyenne. Said he was a business acquaintance of the late Mr. Cross. Calhoun pulled his coat tighter against the cold. Asked a lot of questions about where she was headed, what rancher she was going to, whether the agency in Denver kept records of placements. The snow fell between them. "He get off in Cheyenne?" Cole asked. Calhoun met his eyes. He did not. Cole looked at the boarding house door, where Margaret Cross and her daughters were pulling on their coats. He looked back at Calhoun. "Thank you," he said. "Figured you should know what you're driving home," Calhoun said, and walked back to his horses. Cole sat on the wagon seat in the falling snow and pressed his thumb against his left hand, against the place where a ring had been for 7 years and had been gone for 4, and felt the old familiar weight of a decision that has already made itself. Whatever was coming, it was coming to his land. And on his land, the rules were his. He watched Margaret come through the boarding house door, one hand holding Daisy against her side, Alice one step behind them, and she looked up at him on the wagon seat with those green eyes that had been calculating exits since she stepped off that coach. And for just a moment, just one, she stopped calculating. She just looked at him. He reached down and held out his hand to help her up. She looked at it for a half second. That reflex again, that deep-wired hesitation. And then she took it. Her hand was cold, and her grip was stronger than he expected. He pulled her up. The wagon ride north took 40 minutes in good weather. That evening, with the snow coming down steady and the creek crossing glazed with a fresh skin of ice over the old, it took closer to 2 hours. Cole drove and said nothing. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the dark and the cold and the falling snow created a particular kind of silence that felt less like absence and more like the land itself asking everyone to be still for a while. Daisy fell asleep against her mother's side before they'd cleared the edge of town. Alice sat on Margaret's other side with her hands in her lap and watched the snow-covered ground move past them, and did not sleep, and did not speak. And Cole had the sense that Alice very rarely did either when she was in an unfamiliar place. After a mile or so, Margaret's voice came out of the dark beside him, quiet enough not to wake Daisy. "How bad is the crossing?" "Manageable," Cole said. "I'll take it slow." "Have you crossed it in worse?" "Most winters." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What happens if the ice breaks?" "Horses know what to do. Water's only 3 feet deep at the crossing this time of year." He glanced sideways at her. "It won't break."
"I checked it this morning." She nodded. He felt more than saw it. A slight shift of her weight, something releasing in her shoulders. Not trust, not yet. Just the specific relief of a person who has been given accurate information for once and knows what to do with it. The crossing held. The horses picked their way across with the careful delicacy of animals that understood ice. And Cole kept the reins loose and let them work. And on the other side, the road rose gently toward the valley, and the snow thinned a little under the shelter of the ridge. Alice spoke for the first time since they'd left town. "Is that your place?" Cole looked where she was looking. The ranch sat in the shallow valley below. The cabin windows lit amber from the banked fire he'd left before dawn. The barn, a dark shape against the white ground. Smoke rising straight up from the chimney into the still, frozen air. "That's it," he said. Alice studied it for a moment. "It looks warm," she said. There was something careful in the way she said it. Not a compliment exactly, more like a fact she was allowing herself to register. "It is warm," Cole said. "That's the main thing about a house." He pulled the wagon up to the porch and set the brake and climbed down. And by the time he came around to the other side, Margaret had already gotten herself down and was reaching up for Daisy, who woke halfway and wrapped both arms around her mother's neck and went back to sleep again in the same motion. Alice dropped down on her own before he could offer a hand, landed clean in the snow, and stood looking at the cabin door like she was deciding something. "Go on in," Cole said. "Fire's banked, but it'll come back fast. There's a lantern on the table, matches beside it." Alice looked at him, looked at the door. Then she turned the handle and went in. And a moment later, the lantern light grew inside the window. Cole carried the trunk. Margaret carried Daisy. The snow had picked up again, coming sideways now off the ridge, and the cold had that particular edge that meant it intended to get worse before morning. Inside, the cabin was dim and cold, but not deeply cold. The kind of cold that retreats when you throw 2 logs on the coals and give it 10 minutes. Alice was standing by the fireplace with the matches, looking at the banked fire with a serious expression of someone assessing a problem. "You know how?" Cole asked. "My father showed me," she said, and then stopped. Something moved through her face quickly, there and gone. Cole understood. He did not comment on it. "Kindlings in the box on the left," he said. "The small pieces first." She knew. She did it correctly and efficiently, and without asking for help. And when the fire caught and began to grow, she stood back and watched it, with her arms crossed and her chin level in a way that looked, just for a moment, exactly like her mother. Margaret had put Daisy down on the bed in the back room, the smaller of the 2 rooms, and came back into the main room, pulling her coat tighter and looking at the space with eyes that were doing what they'd been doing since she stepped off the stage. Measuring, cataloging, filing everything away for later evaluation. "You built this yourself?" she asked. "Most of it. Neighbor helped me raise the walls." He hung his coat on the peg by the door. "The back room is yours."
You and the girls. I sleep in the loft." She looked at the ladder leading up to the sleeping space built into the eaves. "That's your room." It was. Now it's mine again. He moved to the kitchen area, started the stove. "Nothing's been changed about it." "Ethan," she stopped. "Mr. Hartwell." "Cole," he said. "We're past formality. At least in the house." She was quiet for a moment. "Cole, I want you to understand something." She waited until he turned to look at her. "I'm not here to be a burden. I don't intend to sit in your house and let you carry us. What I told you in that letter, I meant it. I'll work for what we eat. Alice and I both will." "I know you will," he said. "I want to be clear about the terms. Mrs. Cross." He kept his voice level. "Margaret, it's past 9 o'clock on a December night, and you rode 4 days in the cold, and your girls haven't slept in a real bed since Ohio. The terms can wait until morning." He turned back to the stove. "You want coffee or something warm?" A pause. He heard her exhale. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Something between. "Coffee," she said. "Please." They sat at the table while the fire rebuilt itself and the cabin slowly warmed, and Cole made coffee and heated the last of the soup from 2 days ago, and Margaret drank both without comment, which told him more than if she'd spoken. Alice sat across from him with her hands wrapped around her mug and watched him with those measuring eyes. And after a while she said, "There was a man on the stage." Cole looked at her. "From Columbus. He got on the same day we did." Her voice was flat, reporting. "He sat across from us for 4 days. He asked Mama a lot of questions. She stopped answering them after the first day, but he kept asking." She paused. "He got off in Granger Falls, same stop as us. But he didn't go into the office. He just stood there and watched us get off." The fire popped in the hearth. Margaret had gone still beside him. "Alice," she said carefully, "why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were managing everything else," Alice said simply. There was no accusation in it, just fact. "I didn't want to add to it." Cole set down his cup. "What did he look like?" "Medium, brown coat. He had a way of smiling that didn't reach his eyes." Alice's gaze was direct and steady. "I've seen that before." "On your father," Cole said. She didn't answer, which was its own answer. Cole looked at Margaret. She was looking at her hands on the table, very still, her jaw working slightly. Then she looked up, and her eyes were clear and hard, and he recognized the expression. It was the same one she'd worn reading the agency letter on the stage, he imagined. The expression of a woman recalculating the odds. "Robert's brother," she said quietly. "James Cross. He's a lawyer in Columbus. He would have known about the agency. Robert might have told him, or he found the correspondence after." She stopped. "James never liked me." "Does he have legal standing to interfere with you?" She pressed her lips together. "Robert left nothing. There's no estate, no inheritance. But James has money, and he has connections, and he—" She paused. "He's not a man who likes loose ends. I left without his approval and without telling him where I was going." Men like James Cross consider that a kind of insult they don't forget. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." She looked at him. "All right?" "That's the situation. Now we know it." He stood, picked up his coat from the peg. "Tonight you sleep. Tomorrow we talk about what comes next. But not tonight." "You're not—" She stopped, started again. "You're not angry?" He looked at her. "Why would I be angry?" "Because I didn't tell you? Because I'm bringing trouble to your door?
Because any sensible man would what? He met her eyes. Tell me what a sensible man would do. She held his gaze for a moment. Couldn't find the end of that sentence. Get some rest, he said. Both of you. He went back out into the cold to see to the horses, and he stood in the barn afterward for longer than the task required, his hand on Reckoning's neck, the horse warm and solid under his palm, the snow hitting the barn roof in a sound like static. He was thinking about Calhoun's words in the street. He did not get off in Cheyenne. He was thinking about a man with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, sitting across from a woman and two little girls for 4 days, asking questions after he'd been told to stop. He was thinking about the letter in his pocket, still folded along its original creases. I will never, as long as I live, cause you to regret the decision to open your door. He pressed the flat of his hand against the barn wall and felt the cold wood under his palm, and thought about Clara's grave behind the cottonwood, white under the snow now, and about the particular arithmetic of loss, what it costs, what it changes, what it leaves behind in a man that he carries without naming. Then he thought about Alice at the fireplace, efficient and careful, doing the thing correctly without being asked. About Daisy's hand reaching back for her mother off the stage step. About Margaret Cross writing that letter on whatever scrap of paper she'd found in a stagecoach stop somewhere in Colorado. Choosing truth when she could have chosen strategy. Because she'd decided a man deserved accurate information. He pushed off the wall and went back inside. The cabin was warm now. The fire had built itself up properly. Daisy was still asleep in the back room. Alice had fallen asleep sitting up in the chair by the fire, her head drooped forward, her empty mug still in her hands. Cole crossed the room quietly, took the mug from her hands without waking her, and looked at her for a moment. This 10-year-old child who stood in front of her mother and her sister on a stagecoach platform, in the freezing cold, like a soldier at a post. He got the wool blanket from the back of the chair and put it over her, and left her there, because moving her would wake her, and she needed the sleep more than she needed a bed. He was turning for the loft when Margaret said, quietly, from the doorway of the back room,
She does that. Falls asleep sitting up. She's always done it, even when she was small.
She stopped.
She never let herself fall asleep first when Robert was home.
Cole said nothing. There wasn't anything to say to that.
She's been standing guard since she was 6 years old,
Margaret said. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness had a quality to it. The quality of something held in both hands, carefully, because if you set it down, it might break.
She shouldn't have had to do that. A child shouldn't have to know how to do that.
No, Cole said. She shouldn't. Margaret looked at her sleeping daughter for a long moment. Then she looked at Cole.
I will spend the rest of my life making sure she forgets how, she said. That's not a figure of speech. That's what I'm here to do.
I know it is, Cole said. She studied him for a moment in the firelight, that same calculation behind her eyes, but slower now, less urgent, like a problem she was still working but had more time for. Why aren't you afraid? She asked. Of what?
Of us. Of what we've brought with us. Of...
She made a small gesture that encompassed all of it. The letter, the man on the stage, the uncertainty. Most men would be looking for the nearest exit. Cole considered this honestly. I've been afraid, he said. Just not of that. She waited. There was a woman, he said. Her name was Clara. She was my wife. She died 4 years ago, February, of fever. The doctor was 40 miles away, and the snow had the road closed, and I made the wrong call about how long I could wait. He stopped, looked at the fire. I've been afraid since then that everything I get close to, I'll handle wrong. Make the wrong call at the wrong moment.
He paused. That's the fear I have to work around, not yours. Margaret was very still. Then she said, quietly, I'm sorry. About Clara.
Thank you. That wasn't the wrong call, she said. What you did tonight, coming to that stage, reading that letter and not putting us on the next coach back. That's not a man who makes wrong calls. He looked at her. She said it matter-of-factly, not kindly, not as comfort, but as assessment, the way she'd have said the creek crossing was manageable. Like she had evaluated the evidence and arrived at the conclusion and was reporting it. He didn't know what to do with that, so he did what he generally did when he didn't know what to do, which was to be practical. I'm going to ride the property line tomorrow morning, he said. Check the south fence before the storm gets heavier. If that man from the coach is asking around town about where you went, people will tell him. People always tell. He looked at her directly. I want you to stay close to the cabin tomorrow, not because I don't think you can handle yourself, because I need to know where you are. She held his gaze. For a moment, he thought she would argue. He could see it pass through her, the reflex to push back on being told to stay anywhere. But she was a practical woman. She looked at Alice asleep in the chair and at the door behind which Daisy slept, and she made the calculation. All right, she said. If anyone comes to the door while I'm out, you don't open it. I understand. There's a rifle above the fireplace. You know how to use it? She met his eyes without flinching. Robert kept one in the house, she said. I know how to use it. He nodded once. That was enough. She turned to go back to the bedroom and stopped in the doorway with her hand on the frame. Her back was to him, and the firelight caught the auburn in her hair and the mended place on the shoulder of her coat where she'd fixed it herself. Twice, maybe 3 times. Cole, she said. Yeah? She didn't turn around. Thank you. For the supper. For... She stopped. Started again. For not making us ask. He was quiet for a moment. Go to sleep, Margaret, he said. She went. Cole climbed the ladder to the loft and lay down on the cot and put one arm behind his head and stared at the rough-hewn beams above him and listened to the snow against the roof and the fire settling below and the deep particular silence of a house with people in it after 4 years of a house with only himself. He thought about the man in the brown coat who had not gotten off in Cheyenne. He thought about Alice, 10 years old, watching the exits. He thought about Margaret's hand when she took his to climb up to the wagon seat. Cold, grip stronger than expected. The half-second of hesitation before she took it. He pressed his thumb against his left hand, against the memory of the ring. Clara, he thought. I don't know what this is yet. The wind shifted outside, pressing harder against the north wall, and the fire flared once below and settled. And somewhere in the back room, Daisy made a small sound in her sleep and went quiet again. And the snow came down on second, on the ranch, on the 40 acres of frozen Wyoming land he'd built from nothing and called his own. And Cole Hartwell, who had been alone for 4 years and had made a kind of peace with it, lay in the dark and understood that the peace was over. He was not sure in that moment whether that was a loss or something else entirely. He closed his eyes. The storm pressed in against the walls. Below him, in his house, 3 people slept. And for the first time in 4 years, the silence had a different quality to it. It had weight, warm weight. He was asleep before he could decide what to call it. He was up before dawn. The storm had come through hard in the night and left behind the kind of cold that made the air feel brittle, like it might crack if you moved through it too fast. Cole, dressed in the dark, came down the ladder quietly and found Margaret already at the stove. She was in a plain gray dress, her hair pinned back, and she was moving through his kitchen
with the careful efficiency of a woman learning a new space. Opening cupboards quietly, noting where things were, touching nothing she hadn't identified a purpose for. There was already a pot of water heating. She'd found the coffee without asking. She heard him on the ladder and turned. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "You didn't have to," he started. "I know I didn't have to," she said. "The fire was down to coals. It needed building." She turned back to the stove. "How do you take your coffee?" "Black." She nodded like she'd expected that.
He pulled on his coat and hat and gloves and went out to see to the horses. And when he came back in 20 minutes later, the coffee was on the table, and she was cutting the bread he'd baked 3 days ago. And Daisy was sitting at the table in her nightgown, with her hair in all directions, watching her mother work with sleepy, solemn eyes. "Good morning," Daisy said to Cole, very formally. "Morning," he said. She studied him. "You were already outside." "Horses need feeding early." She considered this. "Do horses get hungry the same as people?" "Pretty much." "Do they get cold?" "They do." She nodded slowly, working through the logic. "Then you should feed them breakfast before us," she said. "Because they can't feed themselves, and we can." She looked at her mother. "Right, Mama?" "That's right," Margaret said, not turning from the bread. "That's what Mr. Horseman did," Daisy announced, apparently to the room. "So that's correct." Cole sat down at the table and wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and said nothing. And across the kitchen, Margaret's shoulders moved in a way that might have been a laugh that she kept to herself. Alice came out of the back room 10 minutes later, fully dressed, hair combed, and took her place at the table, with the composure of someone who had been waking up and presenting themselves as functional for years, regardless of how they actually felt. She looked at Cole. He looked at her. "Sleep all right?" he said. "Yes, sir." She paused. "Thank you for the blanket." "You're welcome." She picked up her bread and ate and said nothing else. But she'd angled her chair slightly so she could see both the door and Cole at the same time. And Cole noticed that and did not comment on it. Because the way to get a child like Alice to trust you was not to point out that she didn't yet. He ate quickly, drank his coffee, stood. "I'm going to ride the south fence line. Be back by midday." He looked at Margaret. "Storm came through hard. There may be breaks. I need to check before the cattle find them." She met his eyes. He saw that she remembered what he'd told her last night. "Stay close. Don't open the door." "We'll be here," she said. "There's flour in the bin, dried beans in the crock on the second shelf, salt pork hanging in the cellar. Help yourself to whatever you need." He pulled on his gloves. "The rifle's loaded. You won't need it, but it's there." "I know where it is," she said. He went. The south fence had 2 breaks, which he'd half expected. He spent 2 hours in the cold working the wire, his hands stiff in the gloves, his breath coming in hard, white clouds. The work was familiar, and he let it run on its own track, while the other part of his mind worked the problem of James Cross. A lawyer. Columbus, Ohio. Enough money to put a man on a stage to Wyoming in December. Enough connection to know which matrimonial agency in Denver his dead brother's wife had used. That was not a man acting on impulse or grief. That was a man who had already decided something and was moving deliberately toward it. The question was what he wanted. Robert Cross had died with nothing. Margaret had said so plainly. No estate, no money, no inheritance to dispute. So it wasn't money, or not only money. It was the thing she'd said at the table last night. Men like James Cross consider that a kind of insult they don't forget. A woman from his brother's household slipping away to Wyoming with 2 children and a Denver agency letter, making her own arrangements, refusing to ask permission. That was the kind of story a man like James Cross could not allow to exist unchallenged.
because if it existed, it meant she'd won. Cole pulled the last strand of wire tight, drove the staple, stepped back. He rode into Granger Falls on his way home. Mrs. Aldrich was sweeping her porch when he came down the main street, and she stopped and watched him ride past, with an expression that meant she had something to say. He pulled up. "Mornin', Mrs. Aldrich." "Cole." She set the broom against the rail. "There was a man in here last night, after you left, asking about you." Cole kept his face still. "What kind of asking?" "The kind that tries to sound casual and isn't." She folded her arms. "Brown coat, medium build. Said he was an old acquaintance of yours, passing through. Wondered if you'd come by lately. I told him I didn't know your schedule." She paused. "He asked if you'd had any visitors come in on the stage recently." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I run a boarding house, not a registry." Her chin went up slightly. "He left $1 on the counter and said he'd be in town a few days, and if I remembered anything I should let him know. He's staying at the hotel." "Thank you," Cole said. "Cole," her voice dropped.
That woman and those children, they all right?"
"They're fine."
"You sure?"
He looked at her. "I'm sure." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. The nod of a woman who has decided to extend credit she reserves the right to recall. "You need anything, you send word." He touched his hat and rode. He pushed reckoning harder on the way back than was strictly kind in the cold, but the horse bore it without complaint. And when the ranch came into sight in the pale afternoon light, Cole felt something in his chest ease slightly. The particular relief of arriving somewhere and finding it still standing, which he hadn't felt since Clara. He unsaddled and brushed reckoning down and went inside and stopped in the doorway. The cabin was different. Not changed exactly. Nothing had been moved significantly, nothing rearranged without reason. But there were dishes clean and stacked by the wash basin. There was a smell of something cooking that was not anything he'd taught himself to make. The table had been wiped down. The firewood box had been restacked, the pieces fitted together more efficiently than he'd ever bothered to do it himself. And Daisy was sitting in the middle of the floor with a small pile of dried beans in front of her, counting them into groups with the intense concentration of a child who has been given a job and intends to perform it correctly. She looked up when he came in. "I'm sorting the beans," she announced. "Mama said to take out the bad ones. I found 4 bad ones." She held them up for his inspection. "See? These ones are wrinkly." "Good eye," he said. She beamed and went back to work. Margaret came in from the back room with a pile of mending in her arms. His mending, he realized. The shirts and trousers he'd left heaped in the corner, because he kept meaning to get to it and never had. She stopped when she saw his face.
"I found it in the corner," she said immediately. "I wasn't going through your things. I needed something to do, and Alice said—" "It's fine," he said. She looked at him more carefully. What happened? It wasn't quite a question. He came in fully and closed the door against the cold, and she put the mending down on the chair and waited with her arms at her sides. And he thought again, not for the first time, that she was a woman who had learned to read a room very quickly, because her safety had depended on it. "He's in town," Cole said, "staying at the hotel. He's been asking questions." She was still for a moment. Then she sat down in the nearest chair, not because she was weak, but because she was practical, and her legs had received information her face wasn't showing yet. "James," she said. "Most likely." Alice appeared in the doorway of the back room. She looked at her mother, looked at Cole. Her jaw set in a way that was startlingly, precisely the same as Margaret's. "He followed us,"
Alice said, not a question. "Appears so," Cole said. "What does he want?" Her voice was flat and 10 years old, and furious, in the quiet, controlled way of a child who has learned that loud anger gets you nowhere. "I don't know yet," Cole said. But we're going to find out, before he finds a way to make us find out on his terms. Margaret looked up at him.
What does that mean?
It means I'm going to go talk to him. She stood up immediately.
No.
Margaret, no. She said it the way she'd said things in the letter. Not hard, not loud, just completely certain.
You go talk to him, and you show him where we are. You show him that you know who he is, and that you're concerned enough to come to him. That gives him information he doesn't have yet, and leverage he hasn't earned.
Cole looked at her.
James Cross is a lawyer, she said. He lives and breathes leverage.
You don't walk into a room with a lawyer on his ground unless you know exactly what cards he's holding. Right now, he doesn't know what you know. That's the only advantage we have. Don't give it up for the sake of feeling like you're doing something. The room was very quiet. Daisy had stopped sorting beans. Cole looked at Margaret Cross and understood, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, that the tired woman in the photograph had never been the whole story.
"All right," he said. "What do you suggest?" She sat back down, pressed her hands flat on her knees. He recognized that gesture. It was what she did when she was organizing her thoughts. He'd seen it twice already.
He doesn't know what arrangement we have. He doesn't know the terms. He's going to try to find out before he moves, because James always knows the full situation before he acts.
She looked up. What does a lawyer need to challenge a woman's right to be where she is?
Standing, Cole said.
Legal standing. Exactly. I'm a widow, free to go where I choose and make whatever arrangement I choose. He has no standing to challenge that unless... She stopped.
Unless you're in an arrangement that's irregular, Cole said. Unmarried, living in a man's house, with children. He paused. He'd use that. Say the arrangement is improper, that the girls need to be in a proper household.
He'd say I'm unfit, Margaret said quietly. That I abandoned my husband's family, meaning his family, the Cross family, to come live with a stranger in improper circumstances. He'd make it about the girls.
She looked at him steadily.
That's his play. I know how he thinks. He uses children like chips in a card game.
Alice made a small sound in the doorway. Margaret looked at her.
Come sit down, sweetheart, she said.
Alice came and sat beside her mother, and Margaret put her arm around her daughter's shoulders, and Alice leaned into it, just slightly. The lean of a child who wants the comfort and hasn't entirely given herself permission. Cole looked at the two of them, the mother and the older daughter, both carrying the same careful posture, both with those eyes that saw everything and gave away nothing, and felt something that he didn't have a precise word for. Anger was in it. Something protective was in it. Something that had nothing to do with obligation or arrangement, and everything to do with the simple fact of a 10-year-old girl who had been standing guard since she was 6 years old and deserved to stop. "There's a way to take that play off the table," he said. Margaret looked at him. "I know there is. I'm not saying we have to. I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying it as pressure or as Cole." She said his name with a kind of tired directness. "I know what you're not saying. I'm a grown woman. I understand what the options are." She was quiet for a moment.
"What I don't know is whether it's the right thing to do in haste, because a man in a brown coat is staying at the hotel. Doing things in haste because of men like James Cross is how I ended up in 12 years I can't get back." He sat down across from her. "That's fair. I need you to tell me something honestly." "All right." She met his eyes directly. "If James Cross weren't here, if there was no threat, no lawyer at the hotel, no man who didn't get off in Cheyenne, would you want us to stay?"
The fire in the hearth was the only sound. Cole did not look away from her. "I put the letter next to Clara's coffee cup," he said. "The one from the agency. I left it there for 11 days, because reading it meant deciding, and deciding meant opening something I'd spent 4 years keeping closed." He paused.
I read it on the 12th day and wrote back the same morning, and I've had no regret about that. None.
He looked at Alice, then back at Margaret. "That answer your question?" She studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly.
"Mama?"
Alice said.
"Yes."
"He means it," Alice said. "He means what he says, every time." She said it with the matter-of-fact certainty she'd used at the boarding house. The same tone, the same delivery. "I've been watching." Margaret looked at her daughter. Something in her face shifted. The particular expression of a mother who has raised a child and then, in one moment, sees the full person that child has become. Not small, not fragile. Something weathered and real and entirely itself. "I know you have," she said softly. From the floor, Daisy, who had resumed her bean sorting with magnificent unconcern, held up another bean. "This one's wrinkly too," she said. "That's 5. She paused. "Mr. Horseman, how many bad beans is too many bad beans for the soup?" Cole looked at her. "More than 5, he said. She nodded very seriously. "Okay, so the soup is still good." "Soup's still good," he agreed. He heard Margaret make that sound again, the almost laugh, the one she kept to herself. But this time, when he glanced at her, she didn't look away, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, he saw the exhaustion in her face, without the armor over the top of it. Just tiredness, and something careful and new underneath, like a plant that's not sure yet if the ground is solid enough to root. "I'll ride back to town tomorrow morning," Cole said. "Not to find him, to see Sheriff Briggs. Tom Briggs has been the law in Granger Falls for 8 years. He's a straight man. He should know what's happening on his ground before it becomes a problem on his ground." He looked at Margaret. "He'll want to talk to you eventually." "I know," she said.
I'm not afraid of that.
"I didn't think you were." She looked at the window, the thin winter light going pale gold as the afternoon faded. "Cole, does it bother you, all of this? What you're walking into?" He considered that honestly, the way she'd taught him to in the space of 1 day, because she was a woman who asked straight questions and deserved straight answers. "Clara dying bothered me," he said. 4 years of this house being empty bothered me. The idea of spending the rest of my life talking only to horses and cattle and Pete Hargrove." He paused. "That bothered me more than I was willing to say out loud." He looked at her. "A man coming to my property who wants something that belongs on my property? That doesn't bother me. That just makes me clear about where I stand." Margaret Cross looked at him across the table in the fading light of a Wyoming winter afternoon, her daughter leaning against her side, and her younger daughter sorting beans on the floor between them. And Cole saw the moment something decided itself behind her eyes. Not all the way, not yet, but the first step of a longer road. "All right," she said quietly. "Then we figure this out." Outside, the wind was picking up again, coming down off the ridge with the low, purposeful sound it made when it meant to stay. The temperature was dropping. Somewhere in the north pasture, Cole's cattle were moving together for warmth, the way they always did when the weather intended to be serious. He looked at the door. James Cross was in town. In a hotel room 10 miles south, sitting with his hands on a table, working through the same problem from the other side. Cole had no doubt about that. The difference was that James Cross was working alone. Cole looked at Margaret, and then at Alice, and then at Daisy, still counting beans on the floor, with her small face bent in concentration. and he felt the thing that he'd felt on the wagon seat the night before. The weight that was warm weight. The silence that was not empty. He got up and added 2 logs to the fire, and the cabin grew warmer, and outside the wind pressed against the walls and found them solid. He rode into Granger Falls the next morning before the town was fully awake, which was intentional. The hotel was a 2-story frame building on the east end of the main street. The nicest thing in Granger Falls, by the low standard of nicest things in Granger Falls. Cole tied reckoning at the rail outside the sheriff's office first and went in, and Tom Briggs was already at his desk with coffee and a week-old newspaper, which was also intentional. Tom Briggs was an early man, always had been, and Cole had timed his arrival accordingly. Briggs looked up. He was a compact, gray-haired man of about 50, with a face that had seen enough of human behavior to have stopped being surprised by most of it. He and Cole were not close friends. They were something more useful than that. Men who respected each other's word. "Cole," he said, "you look like you got something on your mind." "I do." Cole sat down across from him and laid it out plainly, the way Briggs preferred things. Margaret, the arrangement, the man on the stage, Mrs. Aldrich's account, what he knew about James Cross. He did not editorialize. He stated facts in order and let Briggs form his own picture. Briggs listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Cole respected about him. When Cole finished, Briggs set down his coffee cup and was quiet for a moment. "You know for certain it's the brother-in-law?" Briggs said. "I know a man who didn't get off in Cheyenne, got off in Granger Falls, the same time as Mrs. Cross," Cole said. "I know he's been asking questions around town about me, and about recent arrivals. Mrs. Aldrich confirmed it. I know James Cross is a lawyer in Columbus who would have known about the agency." He paused. "I don't know for certain. I know enough." Briggs nodded slowly. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to know the situation before it becomes a situation on your street," Cole said. "And I want to know if he's made any legal inquiries through your office." "He hasn't. Not yet." Briggs tapped his finger on the desk. "A lawyer from Ohio has no standing in Wyoming territory unless he gets a local judge to hear a petition. That takes time, and it takes someone willing to hear it." He looked at Cole steadily. "What's the nature of your arrangement with Mrs. Cross?" Cole met his eyes. "She came on a matrimonial arrangement. She's staying at the ranch." "Unmarried?" "At present." Briggs was quiet for a moment. Cole knew what he was thinking, because Cole had been thinking the same thing since the night before. Wyoming Territory in 1883 was not a place where the law moved swiftly to protect a widow with 2 children living in an unmarried arrangement with a man she'd known for 3 days. Whatever Cole's intentions were not the same as standing. "I'm going to tell you something as a friend rather than a lawman," Briggs said. "If this man is who you think he is, and he wants those children, an unmarried arrangement on a remote ranch is exactly the ground he'll stand on. A judge in this territory will listen to that argument, not because it's right, but because it's the argument that fits the law as it's written." He paused. "You understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand," Cole said. "What are you going to do about it?" Cole looked at him. "What I should do about it." Briggs held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who has received a clear answer to a question that required one. "I'll keep an eye on our visitor at the hotel," he said. "He makes any legal moves, tries to file anything, I'll know before the ink is dry. You'll have warning." "Thank you, Tom." "Cole," Briggs picked his coffee cup back up, "do it proper. License, ceremony, the whole thing. Give him nothing to stand on." Cole walked out into the cold. He stood on the boardwalk for a moment with his hat in his hands and looked at the street and thought about what doing it proper meant. and what it would mean to ask. And what kind of man asks a woman he has known for 3 days to make a permanent legal commitment, not entirely of her own choosing? Then he thought about Alice at the fireplace with the matches, doing it correctly without being asked. About Daisy counting bad beans on the floor with the seriousness of a child who wants to contribute. About Margaret's hands flat on her knees while she organized her thoughts, and the way she'd said, "Men like James Cross consider that a kind of insult they don't forget." Not afraid, not bitter, just clear about the mechanics of the world she'd survived. He put his hat back on and untied Reckoning and rode home. Margaret was hanging the mended shirts on the line strung between the porch posts when he came up the road. Daisy crouched nearby, watching with serious attention, as though the process of hanging laundry contained information she might need later. Alice was splitting kindling by the woodpile with the small axe, slow and careful, working within her strength. She looked up when she heard the horse, evaluated, went back to work. Margaret looked up too. She read his face the way she read everything, quickly, without appearing to. "Come inside," she said. "In a minute." He put the horse up, took his time about it, because he needed the time. He came back, and she was on the porch with a cup of coffee, waiting for him, and the girls were inside. He could hear Daisy's voice through the door, telling a story to someone, possibly herself. And Margaret was leaning against the porch post with her arms crossed and her eyes steady and waiting. He took the coffee. He drank some of it. He looked at the mountains. "Tom Briggs is a straight man," he said. "He'll watch what Cross does and give us warning." "But," Margaret said, "but the arrangement as it stands gives Cross ground to work with." He looked at her directly. "You know that." "I know that," she said. "I want to ask you something," Cole said. "And I want you to hear it clearly, so there's no confusion about what I'm asking." He set the cup down on the porch rail and turned to face her fully. "I'm not asking because James Cross is at the hotel. I'm not asking to solve a legal problem. I'm asking because of what I said yesterday about the letter and the 11 days and having no regret. Because of what Alice said about watching me. Because I think you and I are the same kind of person in ways that matter, and I haven't been able to say that about anyone in 4 years." He stopped, took a breath. "I'm asking because I want to, and I wanted you to know that before I asked." Margaret had gone very still. Her arms were still crossed, but the quality of it had changed. Not defensive, just held. "Ask," she said quietly. "Will you marry me?" He said it plain, the way he said everything. No flourish, no kneeling in the snow. Just the words, standing on his own porch, looking her in the eye. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. The wind came off the ridge and moved her hair across her forehead, and she didn't move to fix it. "You understand what you're taking on," she said. "2 children who aren't yours. A man in a hotel who won't give up easily. A woman who—" She stopped. "A woman who flinches sometimes when a hand moves too fast. Who wakes up at sounds that aren't anything. Who is going to need time before she trusts completely what everything in her says she should trust about you." "I understand all of that," Cole said. "It's not a small thing." "No," he said, "it isn't." She looked past him at the line of mountains to the west, white and enormous against the pale sky. He let her look. He had asked his question, and it was hers now, and he was not a man who took questions back or softened them after the fact. "Alice needs to know," she said finally. "I know she does." Margaret turned and opened the cabin door. "Alice," she called. "Can you come out here, please?" Alice appeared in the doorway, her coat half on, with the look of a child who had possibly been closer to the door than she'd want to admit. She came onto the porch and looked at her mother, then at Cole, then at her mother again.
Cole has asked me something, Margaret said. I want you to know about it before I answer. Alice turned to Cole and waited.
I've asked your mother to marry me, Cole said. He kept his voice even, the same voice he used for everything that mattered. I want you to know what that would mean. It would mean this ranch is your home as long as you want it. It would mean nobody takes you anywhere you don't choose to go. It would mean that whatever trouble followed you here, you face it with somebody standing beside you who has no intention of moving. He looked at her directly. And it would mean I expect nothing from you, except that you be who you already are, which is more than enough. Alice's jaw worked slightly. He watched her do the calculation, the fast, thorough, too old calculation that she'd been running on every situation since she was 6 years old. Looking for the catch, looking for the floor that dropped away. She looked at her mother.
Do you want to?
Margaret looked at her daughter for a moment. Then she said, I think I do. Then you should, Alice said. He means it. She pulled her coat straight and walked back inside, and the door closed behind her. And from inside came Daisy's voice immediately. What did he say? What did he say? And Alice's response, too low to make out. Cole looked at Margaret. She looked at him with those green gold eyes, and the calculation was still there. It would probably always be there, he was beginning to understand. And that was not a flaw, but a fact about a woman who had survived by being careful. And he would spend whatever time he was given proving that the care was no longer necessary on his ground. Yes, she said. He nodded once. All right. That's it? All right? What else should I say? Something moved through her face, exasperation and something warmer underneath it. Most men say, something, she said.
I meant what I said on the porch about why I asked, he said.
I don't have more than that, but I meant all of it. She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up his coffee cup from the rail and handed it back to him. Finish your coffee, she said. We should go to town today if we're doing this. He took the cup. You want to do it today? James Cross is at the hotel and has been asking questions for 2 days, she said. Yes, I want to do it today. I want to walk into Tom Briggs's office with a marriage license, and I want it on file before that man makes a single legal move. She paused. And separately from all of that, I want it done. I am tired of waiting for things to be decided. I have waited long enough for things to be decided. Cole drank his coffee. Give me 20 minutes to get the girls ready, she said, and went inside.
It took 40 minutes because Daisy could not find one of her boots, which had ended up under the bed next to the chamber pot, for reasons Daisy was unable to explain and unwilling to speculate about. Alice found it without comment and put it on her sister's foot, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had found Daisy's boots in unlikely locations many times before. And they came out to the wagon in a line. Margaret first, then Alice, then Daisy hopping the last porch step with both feet together, the way she always did, apparently for the pleasure of it. The road to town was hard-packed snow over ice, and Cole took it steady, and beside him Margaret sat straight, with her hands in her lap, and said very little, which he was learning to read as a form of preparation rather than fear. She went quiet when she was getting ready for something. She got ready quietly, and then she did the thing, and she did not waste words on the middle part. Alice sat behind them with Daisy in her lap, one arm around her sister, and Daisy rode with her face tipped up, watching the sky, the way children watch things that seem to have no purpose, purely for the fact of them. "Are there birds in the winter?" Daisy asked. "Some," Cole said. "Not as many." "Where do the others go?" "South. Warmer weather." "Why don't we do that?" "Cattle can't fly," Cole said.
Daisy thought about this for a moment with great seriousness.
If they could, would you go south?
If they could, Cole said, I reckon we'd all go south. Daisy nodded, satisfied, and went back to watching the sky. Behind him, he heard Alice make a sound that he was fairly certain was the beginning of a laugh that she converted at the last moment into a cough. And Margaret beside him pressed her lips together in that way she had.
They got the license from the clerk at the territorial office, a young man named Garrett, who was new enough to the job that he hadn't yet developed the practiced indifference of his predecessor, and looked genuinely pleased to be processing something that wasn't a land dispute. He filled out the form in careful handwriting and slid it across the counter, and looked at Cole, and then at Margaret, and said, "Congratulations, I suppose." "You suppose right," Cole said. Judge Warren was in his office above the land registry, which was unusual. The judge made his rounds and was more often elsewhere than in Granger Falls. But the cold had kept him in, and when Cole knocked, he opened the door in his shirt sleeves with a pen in his hand and took in the four of them on his landing with an expression of mild surprise. "Hartwell," he said. "Judge," Cole held up the license. "Got a minute?" Warren looked at the license, looked at Margaret, looked at the two girls behind her, Daisy examining the landing railing with focused attention, Alice examining the judge with the same attention she gave everything. He stepped back from the door. "Come in, then." The ceremony took 8 minutes. Warren read the words from the book he'd been using for 30 years, the same words he'd used for ranchers and miners and merchants and their wives, the words that the law required and that meant what they said when the people saying them intended them to mean it. "Do you, Cole Matthew Hartwell, take this woman?" He looked at Margaret when he said, "I do." Not at the judge, not at the book, at her. She was looking back at him in the same way she'd looked at him across Mrs. Aldrich's table, measuring, but with something different in it now, something that was measuring and finding, rather than measuring and waiting. "Do you, Margaret Eleanor Cross, take this man?" She said, "I do," in the steady teacher's voice that didn't waver. And then Warren said something about husband and wife, and signed the certificate, and slid it across his desk, and shook Cole's hand. "You can kiss your wife if you're inclined," Warren said. Cole looked at Margaret. She looked at him. There was a half-second that held more than half-seconds usually hold. He leaned down and kissed her, brief and careful, and her hand came up and held his arm for just a moment, and that moment was enough. "I kissed Mama," Daisy announced to the room, "on her cheek, this morning, before you did." Warren looked at her. "Noted," he said gravely. "So I was first," she said. "You were first," Cole confirmed. She looked satisfied and went back to investigating the judge's bookshelf with her hands behind her back, in the manner of someone who has been told many times not to touch things and has developed a workaround. Alice was standing by the window. She had watched the whole ceremony with those careful eyes, and now she was looking at Cole in a way that was different from the way she'd looked at him before. Not the measuring look, not the guarded look. Something that had set down some of its weight. He crossed the room to her, crouched down so he was at her level. "You all right?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, so only he could hear it, "My father used to say that he loved us. Every time before it got bad, he would say it first." She paused. "I don't need you to say it. I just need you to keep doing what you've been doing." Cole held her gaze. "That I can do," he said. "Every day. You can hold me to it." She nodded once, the same nod he used himself, and looked back out the window. It was on the way out, on the landing above the street, that they saw him. Brown coat, medium build, standing across the street with his hands in his pockets,
not pretending to be there for any other reason. He was looking up at them, and he had the smile Alice had described, the kind that occupied only the lower half of a face. Margaret stopped on the landing. Cole felt her go still beside him. That deep-wired stillness, the old reflex. He put his hand over hers on his arm. She looked down at it. Then she looked back up at the man across the street. "James," she said, not loud, just naming him. James Cross looked at Cole's hand over hers, looked at the marriage certificate that Margaret was holding. Something moved through his face. Not defeat exactly, not yet, but the recognition of a man who has arrived at the table and found the cards already dealt. Cole looked at him across the frozen street with the flat, steady look he'd used on Pete Hargrove. The one that didn't need volume or movement to carry its full weight. James Cross held the look for 5 seconds.
Then he turned and walked back toward the hotel. Daisy, who had been watching with her chin at railing level, said, "Who was that man?"
"Nobody important," Alice said, beside her. Cole looked at Margaret. She was still watching the place where Cross had been, her jaw set, her hands steady on his arm now, rather than rigid. Working through something, letting something settle. Then she looked up at him. "He'll try something else," she said. "Probably. Are you ready for that?" He looked at her. This woman who had written the truth on a piece of paper and handed it to a stranger, and climbed onto a wagon in a Wyoming blizzard with her 2 daughters, and faced everything that came at her with her chin level and her hands steady and her eyes open. "Are you?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then something in her face shifted. Not the armor, not the calculation, not the careful management of what she showed. Something underneath all of that. Something that had been waiting a long time for ground solid enough to stand on. "Yes," she said, "I am." Alice took Daisy's hand at the top of the landing steps. "Come on," she said to her sister. "Watch the ice." They went down together, and Cole and Margaret followed, and behind them the door to Warren's office clicked shut, and the marriage certificate was in Margaret's hand, and the street was cold and white, and James Cross was not on it anymore. Cole untied Reckoning from the rail and helped Margaret up to the wagon seat, and she took his hand this time without the half-second of hesitation. And the grip was the same, strong, cold, certain, but different now, in the way that everything was different now. Not in what it was, but in what it meant. He climbed up beside her. Alice settled Daisy in the back and climbed in after her. "Mr. Horseman," Daisy said. Cole looked back at her. "Yeah, is it far home?" He looked at her. This 6-year-old girl with her mother's eyes and her wild hair and her magnificent, uncomplicated certainty about how the world should work. And he felt the thing again, that warm weight, and this time he had a name for it. 40 minutes, he said, in good weather. "Is it good weather?" He looked at the sky, cold and flat and white, and holding more snow behind it, the way Wyoming winters did, the way they kept something in reserve just to remind you who was in charge out here. "Good enough," he said. He clicked to Reckoning, and they moved out of Granger Falls and onto the road north, and the town fell away behind them. And ahead the road was white, and the mountains were white, and the sky was white, and the ranch was 40 minutes away in the cold, waiting the way it always waited. Solid and his, and now theirs. James Cross did not leave Granger Falls. Cole found that out 2 days later when he rode in for supplies, and Mrs. Aldrich met him at the door of the boarding house, with the particular expression of a woman who has information she considers your right to have. Cross was still at the hotel. He'd been seen at the land registry office and at the courthouse, and twice in conversation with Morris Garrett, the young clerk who'd processed the marriage license. What he'd been asking for,
Nobody knew exactly. What he'd been told, Cole intended to find out. He went to Tom Briggs first. Briggs was waiting for him, which meant he'd seen Cole come down the street. He had papers on his desk that he'd clearly been looking at before Cole knocked. "Sit down," Briggs said. Cole sat. "Cross filed a petition yesterday afternoon with Judge Warren." Briggs turned one of the papers and slid it across the desk. "He's claiming the marriage was contracted under duress and without proper consideration. He's also claiming that Mrs.
Hartwell, your wife, is unfit to have custody of those children on grounds of moral instability and reckless conduct." Cole looked at the paper. He read it the way he read everything that mattered. Slowly, completely, without letting his face do anything until he'd finished. Moral instability, reckless conduct, abandonment of familial obligation. "He has a doctor's affidavit," Briggs said, "from Columbus. Says Margaret Cross exhibited signs of mental disturbance in the months before her husband's death. Emotional volatility, irrational behavior, failure to maintain appropriate domestic standards." Cole set the paper down. "It's manufactured," Briggs said. "You and I both know that. But Warren has to hear it because it's been properly filed, and there are children involved, and the law is the law." He paused. "Hearing is set for Friday. 3 days." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Warren's a straight judge." "He is, but straight judges work with the evidence in front of them, and right now the evidence in front of him is a lawyer from Ohio with a doctor's affidavit and a story about a widow who ran off to Wyoming with a man she'd never met." Briggs leaned forward. "You need to give Warren a different story, a true one, with something behind it." "What does that mean, practically?" "It means witnesses. People who can speak to Margaret's character and your circumstances. It means documentation of what Robert Cross actually was, if you can get it. And it means Margaret herself, standing in that courtroom, because there is no substitute for a woman speaking her own truth to a judge who is trying to decide if she's capable of raising her children." Briggs looked at him steadily. "She's going to have to do that. Can she?" Cole thought about the woman who had written the truth on a piece of paper and handed it to a stranger. About the woman who had stood on the porch and told him what leverage meant and how not to give it away. About the woman who had said, "I do," in a judge's office 3 days ago, without her voice wavering once. "She can," he said. He rode home faster than the road warranted. Margaret was at the table when he came in, writing a letter. She wrote letters in the mornings while the girls were occupied. Neat, careful letters in that educated hand. And Cole had not asked to whom, because it was her business, and she would tell him when she wanted to. She looked up when the door opened and read his face before he'd taken his coat off. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He put the copy Briggs had given him on the table in front of her and watched her read it the same way he had, completely, without expression, all the way to the end. When she finished, she set it down and pressed both hands flat on the table. "Moral instability," she said. "Yes." "He used Dr. Harmon." She said the name with a particular flatness. Harmon was Robert's doctor, Robert's friend. He came to the house twice in the last year, both times after... She stopped. "Both times he saw me with injuries and wrote in his notes that I was emotionally volatile and prone to exaggeration." She looked up. "Because Robert asked him to. Because Robert was always preparing the ground." "We can challenge the affidavit," Cole said. "With what? Our word against a doctor's document?" "With the truth," Cole said, "and with people willing to tell it." She looked at him for a moment. "What people? I've been here 5 days, Cole. I don't know anyone in this territory." "Mrs. Aldrich knows you," he said. "She fed you supper without asking questions,
and refused Cross's dollar. She'll stand up and say what she saw. He sat down across from her. Briggs will testify to the circumstances under which Cross arrived and what he's been doing in town. Judge Warren has known me for 12 years,
And you, he met her eyes. You're going to stand up in that courtroom and tell Warren exactly what you told me in that letter. Every word of it. She was very still.
Margaret? I know. She pressed her lips together. I know I have to. I'm not afraid of that. She looked at the paper again. I'm afraid of what it costs Alice. To have it all said out loud in a room full of people. To have her father's name in a courtroom. She paused. She's 10 years old. Then we ask Alice, Cole said. Margaret looked at him. She's 10 years old, he said, and she has been making adult decisions about her own safety since she was 6. She deserves to have a say in this one. They called Alice in from the back room where she'd been reading to Daisy, and they told her plainly what was happening, because Alice was not a child who was served by being protected from plain information.
She sat at the table and listened to everything without interrupting, her hands in her lap, her face doing what it always did, processing, filing, calculating. When they finished, she looked at her mother. He wants to take us back to Ohio. He wants legal control over where you live, Margaret said, which could mean Ohio. With him. Possibly. Alice looked at the paper on the table. He came to the house once, she said. After Daddy, after one of the bad times. He looked at Mama's arm, and he said to Daddy, "She really does bring it on herself, doesn't she?" She said it flatly, a fact being reported. I was 7. I remember because I thought the words were wrong, but I didn't have the words for why they were wrong. Margaret closed her eyes for a second. You have them now, Cole said to Alice. She looked at him. Yes, sir. Would you be willing to say it? In front of a judge? Exactly what you just said? She thought about it for a moment, the real kind of thinking, not the fast calculation. Yes, she said. I would. She paused. Because it's true, and because true things should be said out loud. Cole looked at her and felt the thing in his chest that he had been calling warm weight for 5 days and was now willing to give its proper name. He loved this child. Not in the way that came from years of accumulation, but in the immediate way that certain things are true the moment you encounter them. The way you know good water from the first drink. All right, he said. Then that's what we do. The 3 days before the hearing were the longest Cole could remember since the winter Clara died. He rode into town twice more, once to speak with Mrs. Aldrich, who said absolutely and without hesitation, and with the particular steel of a woman who has been underestimated by men all her life and has learned to find it useful. Once to speak with an old cattle driver named Henry Seuss, who had known Margaret Cross in Ohio 2 years ago, and had come west to get away from the memory of what he'd seen, and who said he would speak if it came to that. Margaret wrote 3 letters, one to a woman in Columbus who had been her neighbor for 6 years, one to a midwife who had tended her after the worst of the bad times, and one that she did not show Cole, and which he did not ask about. On Thursday night, the night before the hearing, Cole came in late from checking the cattle and found Margaret at the window. Not looking at anything, just standing in the dark with the snow outside and the fire behind her, holding her own elbows. He hung up his coat and came to stand beside her. I keep thinking about what he's going to say about me, she said. In that room, the things he'll call it, the way he'll make it sound. She stopped. I have spent 12 years having my own life described back to me, in words that made it unrecognizable. Robert was very good at that. James is better. You don't have to answer his words, Cole said. You only have to tell Warren yours.
What if it's not enough? He turned to face her. Then we appeal. Then we fight it again. Then we move somewhere his reach doesn't extend, and we fight it from there. He waited until she looked at him. There is no version of this where I stop. You understand that. She looked at him in the firelight. This woman who had learned to read sincerity the hard way, who had built an entire system for detecting the difference between what men said and what they meant, because her survival had depended on getting it right. She looked at him for a long moment. I understand it, she said. And this time, she said it like she meant it, all the way down.
He reached out slowly, the way he always moved with her, giving her time and space, and she watched his hand come up, and she did not flinch, and she did not step back, and he put his hand against her face, careful and steady, and she closed her eyes and leaned into it, the way Daisy leaned into her mother. Just slightly, just enough, the lean of someone allowing themselves the thing they have needed for a long time. You're not going back, he said. Not to Ohio, not to James Cross, not to any of it. That part of your life is done. Whatever happens tomorrow, that part is done. She opened her eyes. They were bright. She pressed her hand over his on her face and held it there for a moment. Then she stepped back and straightened, and the armor came back, but different now. Not the armor of a woman defending against threat, but the armor of a soldier the night before a battle she intends to win. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow's going to be long. He did. And for the first time in the 5 days since she'd arrived, he slept without the part of his mind standing watch. The courtroom in Granger Falls was the back room of the territorial office, and it was too small for the number of people who showed up on that Friday morning. Word had gotten around, the way word got around in small towns, where the arrival of a lawyer from Ohio was the most interesting thing to happen since the fire at the millinery in October. Cole counted 17 people in the room before he stopped counting. Ranchers and merchants and their wives. Pete Hargrove in the back row with his arms crossed. Mrs. Aldrich near the front in her good coat. James Cross sat at the table on the left with a young local attorney he'd retained, a man named Fowler, who had the look of someone who had accepted money he was beginning to regret. Cross himself looked exactly as Alice had described him. Medium, careful, the smile that operated independently of the rest of his face. He looked at Cole when they came in, and then at Margaret with the assessing look of a man reviewing a problem he's already solved. He looked at Alice and Daisy, and the smile went briefly uncertain before it reestablished itself. Cole put his hand briefly on Margaret's back as they sat down, and she sat straight in her chair with the marriage certificate on the table in front of her, and her hand still in her lap. Warren came in, and the room came to order, and Cross's attorney stood up and delivered his case in the clipped, professional manner of someone reading from a prepared document, which he was. Mental instability, reckless conduct, a hasty and irregular marriage with a man of unknown character, 2 children in need of proper family structure. The doctor's affidavit was presented. A letter from Cross himself attesting to Margaret's erratic behavior in the months following Robert's death. Cole watched Margaret's face while Fowler spoke. She looked at Warren the entire time, not at Fowler, not at Cross, just at Warren, steady and direct, the way she looked at everything that mattered. When Fowler sat down, Warren looked at Cole's side of the room. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, you have the right to speak for yourself in this proceeding. Do you wish to do so? I do, Margaret said. She stood. She spoke for 11 minutes. Cole knew because he watched Warren's clock on the wall behind the judge's head. 11 minutes, no notes, no preparation visible. Though he knew she had prepared, had been preparing for 3 days, had been preparing in some form for 12 years.
She told Warren about Robert Cross, not dramatically, not with tears or with visible anger. She told him the way she'd written the letter, plainly, specifically, with dates and details that a manufactured story would not have had. She told him about the incident that left her with 2 broken ribs in the winter of 1881, and about what Dr.
Harmon had written in his notes when he came to the house. She told him about the morning she used the inheritance money to buy stage passage, and about how she had chosen the Denver agency because it was far enough that James Cross would not immediately think to look. She told him about Alice at the fireplace on the first night, doing it correctly without being asked. She told him about Daisy counting beans on the floor, and about Cole teaching them the horses' names, and about the difference between a house where children learn to be quiet and still, and a house where a 6-year-old asked a strange man questions about birds in winter, because she was simply curious and safe enough to be. She said, "I am not an unstable woman. I am a woman who survived an unstable situation and had the sense to get my daughters out of it. Those are not the same thing, and I believe you are capable of understanding that difference, Your Honor." She sat down. The room was completely still for a moment. Then Warren looked at James Cross. "Mr. Cross," he said, "the affidavit from Dr. Harmon. Is this the same Dr. Harmon who was your brother's personal physician and personal friend for 11 years? Fowler started to stand. Warren looked at him, and he sat back down. "It is," Cross said. "And this letter you've submitted, attesting to your sister-in-law's erratic behavior, is this based on personal observation in the period following your brother's death, or on accounts relayed to you by others?" Cross paused for just a moment. "A combination of—" "Thank you." Warren made a note. He looked at Mrs. Aldrich, who testified for 4 minutes with the precision of a woman who does not waste words. He looked at Tom Briggs, who testified for 3 minutes about Cross's behavior in Granger Falls since his arrival. He looked at old Henry Sues, who stood up from the back row without being called, and said, "I got something to say about Robert Cross if the court is willing." And Warren said he was willing. And Henry said what he'd seen in Columbus 2 years ago, in 6 sentences that left the room very quiet. Then Warren said, "Is there anything else before I rule?" Alice stood up. Margaret turned. Cole turned. The room turned. Alice Cross, Alice Hartwell, 10 years old, in her good dress, her hands at her sides, stood up in the back row where she'd been sitting with Daisy, and said clearly, in her flat, careful, completely steady voice, "My uncle came to our house once after a bad time. He looked at my mother's arm, and he said to my father, 'She really does bring it on herself, doesn't she?'" She paused. "I was 7. I'm telling you because it's true, and true things should be said out loud." She sat down. Daisy, beside her, had not made a sound through any of it, which, for Daisy, was its own testament to the weight of the moment. Warren looked at the room for a moment. Then he looked at James Cross. "Mr. Cross," he said, "I'm going to be direct with you, as I believe you are an intelligent man who will appreciate directness. You have traveled a considerable distance to file a petition in my courtroom based on a doctor's affidavit from your brother's personal friend and your own letter attesting to behavior you did not personally witness. Against that, I have the direct testimony of this woman, this child, and 3 members of this community who have no interest in this case beyond the truth of what they know." He paused. "I also have a valid marriage certificate, properly executed in my own office 3 days ago." Cross's jaw was set. He was looking at the table. "Your petition is denied," Warren said. "Mrs. Hartwell is a legally married adult woman of sound mind and stable character, and her children are exactly where they should be." He picked up his pen. "I'll note for the record that any future attempt to file against these parties in this territory without substantially new evidence will be viewed by this court as harassment. Are we clear, Mr. Cross?" Cross said nothing.
I'll take that as yes, Warren said. We're adjourned. The room broke into sound, the way a held breath breaks. Mrs. Aldrich turned around in her seat and looked at Cole with an expression that said, "Well then." Pete Hargrove in the back was looking at the floor in the way of a man who was reassessing some opinions he'd held too comfortably. Henry Sues put on his hat and walked out quietly, his part done. Cole looked at Margaret. She was looking at the marriage certificate on the table in front of her. Her hands were still, the way they were when she was managing something.
Then she picked the certificate up, folded it carefully along its creases, and put it inside her coat. She looked up and found his eyes, and something passed between them. Not words, not the calculation, not the armor. Just the plain thing underneath all of it, finally with enough room to breathe. Alice appeared at their side. She looked at Cross, who was gathering his papers across the room with his back to them, and then she looked at her mother.
"It's over?" she said. "It's over," Margaret said.
Alice nodded once. Then she turned and went to find Daisy, and Cole heard her voice through the noise of the room.
"Come on, Daisy, we're going home."
And he heard Daisy's response, immediate and completely uncomplicated.
"Is there soup? I want soup."
He looked at Margaret. She pressed her lips together, and the almost laugh happened. And this time it went all the way, brief and real and surprised out of her. The laugh of a woman who has not laughed without fear in a very long time.
James Cross left Granger Falls on the afternoon stage. Cole did not see him go. He heard it from Mrs. Aldrich the following morning, and he relayed it to Margaret over coffee. And she held her cup in both hands and looked at the window and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "He'll have to live with who he is. That's enough." Cole thought that was probably right. The weeks that followed were cold and ordinary, and in their ordinariness, quietly extraordinary. The ranch that had been Cole's became theirs in the small daily ways that matter more than legal documents. Margaret reorganizing the kitchen so that things made sense to 4 people rather than 1. Alice learning to ride reckoning at a walk under Cole's supervision, with a focus that suggested she intended to be good at it and would not tolerate being otherwise. Daisy naming every chicken individually and maintaining complex opinions about their personalities. Cole built a proper desk for the main room because Margaret wrote letters and needed a surface that wasn't the kitchen table. Margaret planted the seeds she'd ordered from a catalog she'd found in his stack of unread mail, planning the spring garden with a precision that made him understand the winter stores had not been an accident, but a philosophy. Alice borrowed his 3 books and read them all, and returned them with brief assessments. 1 good, 1 acceptable, 1 she'd found wanting in its logic, which she explained in detail while Cole listened, and found he could not argue with her reasoning. There were hard nights. Nights when Margaret woke with a sound in her throat that was not quite a cry, and lay rigid in the dark until the old reflex subsided and the new knowledge settled back in. That the sounds in this house, with the fire, the wind, the horses, Cole's even breathing beside her. He learned to be still on those nights, present, but not pressing, and she learned to reach for his hand in the dark without waiting until the fear had passed. And that reaching was its own kind of healing, slow and unannounced, the way things that are real tend to happen. On a Sunday morning in late January, 6 weeks after Margaret had fallen in the snow on the Granger Falls stage platform, Cole woke before dawn to find the bedroom empty and both girls' voices coming from the main room. He came down to find Daisy sitting on the floor in her nightgown, with the kitchen cat that had appeared sometime in December and taken up residence without asking permission, and Alice at the table with his copy of the Wyoming Territorial Survey, reading it with a cup of warm milk beside her. The fire was built, the coffee was on. Margaret was at the window. She turned when he came in,
the way she always turned when she heard him. Not startled, not braced, just turning. Her hair was down.
She was wearing the plain wool dress she wore on Sundays, and her feet were bare on the cold floor. And she looked at him in the early gray light, and she looked, he thought, like a woman who has put something down that she has been carrying for a very long time, and has discovered that her hands, empty, are lighter than she'd imagined possible.
"You're up early," he said. "I kept waking up thinking about the garden," she said. "Where to put the beans. Whether the south side gets enough light in February." She paused. "I decided it does." "Probably does," he said. "I want to put in a proper herb bed this year, past the garden, against the fence line. Sage, thyme, rosemary if it'll take the cold." She looked at him steadily. "That's a permanent thing. An herb bed takes 2 years to establish properly." He held her gaze. "I know what it is," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer.
Then she crossed the room and stood in front of him and put her hand flat against his chest, the way she had in the dark on those hard nights. And he covered it with his, and she looked up at him with those green-gold eyes that had spent years calculating and were now, in this moment, perfectly still. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because of James Cross or legal protection or because I have nowhere else to go. Because this is where I want to be. Because you are who I want to be with." She paused. "I want you to know that, separately from everything else. I want you to know I choose this." From the floor, Daisy said, without looking up from the cat, "I choose it too." Alice turned a page in the survey. "Same," she said. Cole looked at his wife, at Margaret Eleanor Hartwell, who had written the truth on a piece of paper and handed it to a stranger, and stepped off a stagecoach in the snow with her daughters, and fought for her own life with a steadiness and courage that had rebuilt, quietly and without ceremony, everything he'd spent 4 years convincing himself he no longer needed. He put his arms around her, careful and certain, and she leaned in the rest of the way, not slightly, not the small lean of someone allowing themselves a limited portion of comfort, but all the way, her forehead against his chest, her hand still over his heart, and he held her in the gray winter morning in the ranch that was theirs, with their daughters nearby, and the fire building, and the snow outside doing what Wyoming snow did, falling, and covering everything, and making the world clean. This was what he had built 40 acres for. This was what Clara's coffee cup had been waiting next to for 11 days. This was what the letter had been, and the 11 days, and the storm, and the crossing, and the courtroom, and the hard nights, and all of it. This was what it had all been making its way toward. Outside, the snow fell on Second Chance's ranch, because that was what Margaret named it the following spring, one morning over coffee, the way she named things, simply and exactly right. And the wind was still, and the mountains stood where they had always stood, and inside the cabin 4 people were home. Not running, not waiting, not surviving. Home.